Today, we're going to talk about the top 10 foods with no sugar and no carbs that matter. And the reason I say matter is going to become apparent very soon. We're going to do a countdown in no particular order. So this is not a ranking. And we're going to start with number 10, which is meat. And that includes things like beef, fish, chicken, wild game meat, etc. And when we look at the amount of carbohydrates in this food, it is 0 for all of them. So why do we care? Whether it has 0 or whatever it has. So what it really comes down to is that different foods affect blood sugar differently. So what we care about is food is, how does it affect blood sugar and how does it affect insulin? Because that affects our metabolism and our energy supply and so forth. But here's what a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people think that carbohydrates are evil, that we should only eat food with 0 carbs. And that is not what I'm saying. If we compare carbohydrates to protein, to fat, then carbohydrates contain glucose. There are different types of sugar, but primarily carbohydrates contain glucose that can very, very quickly become blood sugar. Those two factors influence how much glucose, how much insulin we're going to release. Now, if we look at protein, then we have to understand that there is no such thing really as a 0 carbohydrate food because all foods, including protein, can turn into glucose. Protein contains something called amino acids that primarily they're supposed to become body tissue and hormones. So the amount of insulin response is much, much smaller. And then when we look at fat, fat is kind of interesting because people think that, well, fat is just fat, and fat per se cannot get turned into glucose. To glucose. However, there is something called glycerol. And if we look at a fat molecule, we store them and we eat them in a form called triglycerides. That means that there's 3 fatty acids. But just like with protein, there's a delay and it's a much, much smaller amount. So if we compare again, the carbohydrates has a huge response. The protein has a moderate and the fat has an almost negligible impact on blood glucose and insulin. But this is why we can fast for days and even weeks without eating any carbohydrate because there's enough glucose indirectly available through this glycerol backbone. So if we understand this, then there is truly no food that is really 0 carbs because all food with a caloric value can be partially turned into glucose. The only truly 0 carb foods are water, tea, and coffee. Things with no caloric value. So what we need to focus on is not the 0 foods as much as low carb foods and slow carb foods. Another thing that there's a lot of confusion about is net carbs and why that matters. So when I talk about net carbs with different foods, I'm talking about the available amount of carbohydrate that we can turn into energy per 100 grams of food. So total carbs, when we subtract the fiber, then we get net carbs. And why do we subtract the fiber? Because it is not available to humans to digest and turn into energy. We can't metabolize it. So a lot of people on low-carb diets. They hear that. Well, don't worry about net carbs. Just look at the total carbs. And if you're looking to go low-carb or even ketogenic, that should probably be around 50 grams of total carbs. But some of that is fiber. So one food, for example, a mystery food that we're going to reveal in a moment, would have 6 grams of total carbs. However, 8 grams out of those carbs are fiber, meaning you cannot turn that into energy, does not affect glucose. I can actually eat quite a bit of that. And there's some controversy about fiber. Historically, I think humans have eaten quite a bit of fiber. Now in the carnivore camp, they're disputing whether fiber is really necessary at all. I believe that for long-term optimal health, I do think that fiber plays a role because fiber feeds our gut bacteria, and our gut bacteria is tremendously important for our overall health. We need a large number and a large variety of gut bacteria. So fiber has no calories. It has no impact on blood glucose because we do not have the enzymes as humans to break it down. It does not impact blood sugar, and therefore it does also not impact insulin at all. And as we talk through today, we also want to look at the bigger picture, the balance. But if you had a little bit of a fiber, or if you had some protein, or if you had some fat, then that sugar is not as readily available. So that's going to slow down the absorption a little bit. And that would be a good thing. So when we have a certain amount, a small amount of carbohydrate with fiber and with protein and with fat, then it doesn't have the same impact. Food number 9 is non-sweet fruit. And the reason I call it that is these are things that a lot of people think about as vegetables, but technically in the pure classification scheme of things, avocado is a fruit, and these are the numbers we saw on a previous slide. So this is indeed the mystery food that I talked about. It has 6 grams of total carbs. It has 8 grams of fiber for only 8 net grams, which is amazing. So you can eat a ton of this food. It has plenty of healthy fats, tons of good fiber. And most of this fiber is the soluble kind that will feed your gut bacteria. Another great non-sweet fruit is olives, which has 1 grams of net carbs per 100. And also tomato is also a fruit. Now, depending on the tomato, some of those could taste sort of sweet, but it's still a very low amount of sugar and net carbohydrates, too. 7 grams. Food number 8 is leafy greens. And it does have a tiny amount of carbohydrate, but not to the degree that it matters. So lettuce has 2 grams of net carbs. It has tons of fiber, lots of water, and this carbohydrate is packaged inside fibrous cells. So it takes a long time to release that glucose, and there's virtually no way to just eat lettuce and spike your blood sugar significantly. Arugula, very low, 1. Spinach, 4. Swiss chard, 1. Cabbage. Some people would probably put this in its own category, but I had room here so I just lumped it together with the cabbage. 3. And kale would be 5. Now, some of these that we want to watch out for is a lot of people are sensitive to oxalates, and then they might want to stay away from spinach and kale, even though it's sort of classified in every list as this superfood that everyone should eat as much as possible. There are a lot of people who don't tolerate kale all that well, so just because someone calls it a superfood doesn't mean that your body is going to love it. So just keep that in mind when other people tell you what foods are good for you. Number 7 is non-starchy vegetables. So here we have one of my favorites is broccoli, very low 4 grams of net carbs. We have cauliflower at 3. And these are tremendous good sources of potassium and various different minerals. Asparagus at 9. We have bell pepper. Depending on the color, it could be like with green bell pepper, probably around 3, and the red and yellow varieties would be a little bit higher, probably around 4. Also, eggplants very low 9. Green beans, depending on some of the very slender ones, the French style would be maybe 2 grams, and some of the sugar snaps could be as high as 5. But all of these foods are low starch, non-starchy, very low carb foods. It'd be very difficult to spike your blood sugar significantly. So again, We want to focus on the carbs that matter in terms of insulin and glucose, because like I said, there are very few true zero-carb foods. Number 6 is berries. One of my favorites is raspberries at 5 net grams per 100. And a few berries go a long way, so this is 5 grams per 100, so if you have maybe 10 raspberries, that's probably like 35-40 grams of total berries, so you get less than 2 grams in 10 berries. If you have blackberries, it's about the same. If you have strawberries, also about the same. And blueberries come in a little bit higher. It doesn't necessarily taste sweeter to the tongue, but it is almost twice as high in sugar at 9. Now what makes berries so unique and so attractive is not just that they are very, very low in sugar compared to other fruits, but also that they're much higher in fiber. And like we said, the fiber further slows down this small amount of carbohydrates. Other fruits are kind of the other way around. They probably have 4, 5, 6 times more sugar than they do fiber. So it's not just the amount of sugar, it is also how quickly it's absorbed. Number 5 is nuts. And here my favorite would be macadamia, followed by pecans, followed by walnuts. And then a lot of people in the low-carb community also love almonds and peanuts. So my macadamia nuts have 2 grams of net carbs, pecans have 3, walnuts 0, so those are very low, especially when we look at how much protein, fat, and fiber is in there as well. So this small amount of sugar is absorbed very, very slowly. Now almonds, at 9. 1 and peanuts at 13.5. So the amount of carbs doesn't necessarily turn these into bad foods, but a lot of people, as they start eating more and more almonds, they start getting reactions because almonds actually has something called lectins. That is a way that plants defend themselves from getting eaten. It's type of mild poison, if you will. And some people are very sensitive and other people probably not so much, but it is something to keep in mind that if the more you eat of something, the greater the probability that your body will develop a sensitivity to it. And peanuts, same thing. They also have lectins, but furthermore, peanuts, of course, is not really a nut. It's a legume. It's more like a bean, like a kidney bean or black bean. Number 4 is seeds. And they're sort of similar to nuts in their nutritional makeup. Nuts are probably more of a snackable food, whereas seeds would be more something that you would add to a food. They're maybe not as tasty to some people, at least not all of them. But flax, chia, hemp, and pumpkin seeds are my favorite that I eat on a regular basis. I sprinkle them on yogurt, for example. Flax has only 6 grams of net carbs. Chia has 4, hemp has 3, and pumpkin 7, so these are very small amounts. And again, just like nuts, there is a tremendous amount of protein, fat, and fiber in these. So these small amounts of carbs are going to be absorbed extremely slowly. So it really doesn't matter. We're not looking for a zero number as much as we're looking for whether it matters or not. Number 3 is fats and oils. You want to keep your protein moderate and then the rest becomes fat. So you kind of fill up on fat after that. So extra virgin olive oil would probably be my overall favorites. Butter, coconut oil, MCT oil, lard, and tallow are other good versions. And these are all good because they require minimal processing. You don't have to be afraid of fat, but that does not mean that more fat is always better. You eat very low carb, you eat moderate protein, and then you eat fat to satiety. But that does not mean that more fat is better. If you are fine with a black coffee in the morning and that carries you to lunch or dinner, then adding butter to that coffee is not an advantage. It is only to help you transition. So if you go from a high carb or a moderate carb diet to low carb, then it's good to add a little extra fat to help you transition, to help you become fat adaptive, especially the MCT oil. You can have just like a teaspoon of MCT oil to help you make some ketones, some quick energy, but the goal is to burn the fat off your body, not to burn the fat that you're eating. So the more fat you're adding in the diet, the less the incentive is to burn it off the body. Food number 2 is eggs. And eggs, we can eat them whole, but of course, humans like to mess with things, so we often break them apart into the white and into the yolk. And depending on your belief system, you might eat more or less of one or the other. But when we look at the net carbs, they're all very, very low in carbohydrates. So a whole egg has about 1.7% carbohydrate. Most of that is in the yolk percentage-wise. So the white has about 0.7 and the yolk has about 3.6. But where a lot of people get into trouble, like bodybuilders, they hear that the egg white is where you have the protein. Nature created possibly the most perfect balanced food available to us, and it put the white and the yolk together. And the difference here is that there are different amino acids, there are different percentages and ratios of amino acids in the yolk and in the white. So when we eat them separately, we're not getting as good a balance. Transcribed, and when we eat the whole egg, we can utilize 49% of all the amino acids can turn into body tissues. They are so close in the combinations of amino acids to what our body needs to put together to make tissue that we can use 49%, which is the highest of any food that we can eat other than mother's milk. If we only eat the white, this drops tremendously, but because a lot of these combinations of amino acids we need are in the yolk, so they complement each other. So we're going to look at skim milk, whole milk, half and half, heavy cream, and we're going to look at them in terms of net carbs and in terms of fat, and then also in terms of percentage of calories from carbohydrate. But we'll start with these two, and in terms of grams of carbohydrate per 100 grams of food or fat per 100 grams of food. If we look at milk, the skim, the whole, etc., all of these are basically low-carb foods. And they're at 5 grams or less. As we look at the fat, we see that skim milk obviously has virtually no fat. Whole milk has more half and half, has more heavy cream, has 3 times, and cheese is close to heavy cream in terms of fat content. So as the fat content increases, and in cheese there's also more protein, the percentage of carbohydrate decreases. But still it's not a tremendous change. The red bar is still kind of similar. But where it really it makes a difference is when we look at the percentage of calories from carbohydrates. So we're going to look at that over here, and in skim milk, we think of milk as sort of a protein food, etc., but in skim milk, almost 70% of the calories come from carbohydrate from lactose. When we look at half and half or cream, the percentages drop further and further. So we go from skim milk, which is a high carbohydrate food, to cream, which is a very low carbohydrate food. And then cheese would be the lowest because there is a lot of protein in there as well. But the key point here is, like we talked about all throughout this video, is that it's not about the carbohydrates necessarily. They're roughly the same for most dairy products. However, when we look at the percentage of calories, we go from a high carbohydrate food to almost a zero carbohydrate food. Obviously, if you watch this video again, you can follow along and really get all the detail. Make sure you subscribe, hit that bell and turn on all the notifications.